Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, embodied understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material. So I want you to just imagine for a second watching someone completely destroy their own wedding.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's intense.
Right. Like, picture the groom standing right there at the altar. He turns to his fiancée in front of their entire community, their families, literally all their friends, and he just publicly humiliates her.
Which is, it's the ultimate nightmare scenario.
Exactly. He completely obliterates her reputation, stops the entire wedding dead in its tracks, and just walks out. And why? Because the night before, from a distance, he saw a shadowy figure in a window and instantly assumed, the absolute worst.
He didn't even look into it.
No. He didn't investigate. He didn't ask a single question. He just detonated his entire life. So today we are taking a deep dive into a 400-year-old case study in cancel culture, deepfakes, and the terrifying power of confirmation bias.
It is a scenario that sounds incredibly modern, right? Yet it sits at the exact center of what many consider to be just a lighthearted comedy.
Yeah, a comedy, which is wild.
Right, and that contrast is precisely why this text is so vital. It forces us to examine the terrifying fragility of human perception. We desperately want to believe that our eyes and our ears are these objective tools, like infallible recording devices.
Right, like we see exactly what's there.
Exactly. But the reality is that our perception is constantly being hijacked by our own insecurities, our social conditioning, and, well, our pride.
So if you're listening to this right now, you are probably thinking, I would never fall for a trick like that. I would never destroy a relationship over a shadow.
We all think that.
We do.
Mm-hmm.
But think about the last time a piece of gossip perfectly aligned with your worst fear about a coworker or a friend or, a partner. Did you instantly fact check it? Or did your brain just quietly accept it because it felt perversely validating?
Oh, that's such a good point. That perverse validation.
Right. That is the psychological minefield we are navigating today. We are taking a massive deep dive into William Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing. And we aren't just reading it as a play, we are dissecting it alongside the brilliant and honestly piercingly cynical historical commentary of the 19th century essayist William Hazlitt.
Hazlitt is just the perfect guide for this because he refuses to let Shakespeare's characters off the hook.
He really does hold their feet to the fire.
He does. He looks past the poetry and examines the raw, often ugly human machinery underneath. Our objective today is to strip away the 16th century costumes and look at the bare psychological wiring.
Yeah, the real human element.
Exactly. Why do we build such massive intellectual walls? Why are we so easily manipulated by what we overhear? And what does it actually take to get us to drop our armor?
To understand the bizarre behavior in this story, we can't just look at what the characters do, right? We have to look at the incredibly specific environment they're operating in.
The context is everything here.
It really is. So the setting is the city of Messina, and a war has quite literally just ended. Don Pedro, this victorious prince, arrives at the estate of Leonato, the local governor, and he brings his soldiers with him.
This is key.
Yeah, because I read this opening setup, and the first thing that struck me wasn't the romance. It was the adrenaline crash.
That is exactly the right lens to view this through. You have a society of young men who have been operating in a state of, high stakes, life or death neurological arousal.
Right. Their nervous systems are just completely fried.
Absolutely. War requires absolute binary thinking. It's friend or foe, live or die. Suddenly the war is over. The threat is gone.
But the body doesn't know that.
No, the neurological momentum doesn't just switch off. There's a massive psychological vacuum. And what's fascinating is how quickly and sometimes recklessly the human brain seeks a new target for all that displaced energy once a crisis has passed.
It's the ultimate idle hands scenario. You take off the literal armor, and the brain starts scrambling for something, anything, to focus on. And this brings us to our first pair of levers. We have the young decorated soldier, Claudio, and the governor's daughter, Hero. Hazlitt spends a lot of time analyzing Claudio's sudden infatuation with Hero. And frankly, the way Claudio talks about falling in love feels almost, calculated.
Calculated is a great word for it. Hazlitt's analysis of Claudio is incredibly perceptive on this point. He notes that Claudio's confession of love is a perfect, almost pristine image of youthful affection rushing to fill a void.
It's just plugging a hole.
Exactly. Let's look at the actual mechanism of what Claudio says to his commander. He explicitly states that his war thoughts have left their places vacant. And into those empty rooms of his mind come thronging soft and delicate desires.
That word thronging is doing a lot of heavy lifting. It implies a crowd, right? Like a sudden rush, almost an invasion of romantic thoughts.
It's totally overwhelming.
Yeah, he literally tells the prince, he says, prompting me how fair young hero is, saying, I liked her ere I went to wars. It sounds like he'd mentally bookmarked her.
Like a tab left open in his browser.
Yes.
Yes.
Like, she's attractive, but I have a war to fight right now. He goes off, fights, survives, comes back, and the second the adrenaline fades, the bookmark pops up.
Precisely. And notice the mechanism of how he proceeds. If this were a sweeping, uncontrollable passion, he would run straight to Hero, right?
Right. You'd think so.
But he doesn't. He goes to Don Pedro, his prince and superior officer. He asks about Leonato's estate. He is engaging in courtly love, which in the 16th century was fundamentally a negotiation of status, property, and conventional milestones.
It's incredibly formal.
Very.
Right.
Hazlitt points out that Claudio is traditional. He does exactly what a young man of his station is supposed to do.
It feels like the historical equivalent of someone downloading a dating app the exact second they get a promotion and move to a new city.
Oh, that is exactly what it is.
Right. They've checked the career box, so now they need to check the marriage box.
Yeah.
There is a vacancy to fill, a life milestone to achieve. It feels safe, structured, and entirely dependent on outside approval.
It's love by the numbers.
Exactly. But then, standing in stark contrast to this incredibly rigid, conventional courtship, we have Beatrice and Benedict. And they are operating on a completely different psychological wavelength.
They're the absolute inverse of Claudio and Hero. If Claudio and Hero are hiding behind the masks of convention and polite society, Beatrice and Benedict are hiding behind the masks of cynical intellect.
They're just so sharp.
They really are. They are locked in what Leonato calls a merry war of wits. Benedict loudly and repeatedly vows that he will live as a bachelor forever, and his stated reason is fundamentally tied to a massive cultural fear. He refuses to become a cuckold.
Let's break that down for the listener, because cuckold isn't a word we throw around much today. But in this patriarchal society, it was the ultimate terror for a man.
Absolutely terrifying. The cuckold is the man whose wife is unfaithful to him. In Renaissance culture, a cuckold was traditionally represented as wearing invisible horns on his head.
Like a mark of shame everyone can see but him.
Exactly. It was an intense, pervasive social anxiety. In a society where a man's entire worth was tied to his honor, and where lineage and property inheritance depended entirely on a woman's fidelity, the idea of being secretly betrayed by a wife was existentially terrifying.
So it's not just a bruised ego, it's a total loss of societal standing.
Right. Benedict's obsession with not being made a fool of by a woman is rooted in this deep-seated systemic vulnerability.
So his defense mechanism is to just loudly reject the entire game.
Yeah.
She essentially says, you can't lose if you refuse to play.
A classic defense mechanism.
And Beatrice matches his energy perfectly. She says she would rather hear her dog bark at a crow than a man swear he loves me. They are absolutely brutal to each other.
Brutal, but brilliant.
Yeah, but as I was reading their exchanges, I kept thinking of a very specific modern archetype. Beatrice and Benedict are exactly like those people you see whose entire online persona is aggressively single and unbothered.
Oh, I know exactly the type.
Right. They constantly post cynical memes about how everyone is toxic, how modern dating is a scam, how they only need their pets and their peace.
It is a brilliant parallel because the psychological machinery is identical. Hazlitt notes in his commentary that Benedict is a professed and staunch enemy to marriage who always has very plausible-sounding reasons for his stance.
He intellectualizes it?
Exactly. He uses logic to build a fortress. Beatrice, conversely, uses humor and sarcasm. Hazlitt says she turns absolutely everything into a jest so she can remain proof against anything serious.
Nothing can touch her if she's laughing at it.
Right. Hero even observes that Beatrice's wit values itself so highly that to her all other matters seem weak.
They use their intellect as a shield. They reject the world before the world has a chance to reject them. Which brings us to the core tension of this entire deep dive.
The two masks.
Exactly. You have these two different types of masks. The mask of convention and the mask of cynical intellect. And the entire plot of this story revolves around how easily both of those masks can be exploited through deception.
And this brings us to the much ado of the title. Deception is the engine of this story. Now, usually we view deception as purely negative, right? Like a breach of trust.
Sure, usually it's a bad thing.
But Shakespeare does something fascinating here. He presents us with two parallel plots of deception. One is engineered entirely to build people up, and the other is engineered entirely to destroy them. Let's examine the benevolent trick first, orchestrated by Don Pedro.
Right. Don Pedro essentially decides he is bored and wants to play Cupid. So he sets up this elaborate theatrical trap.
It's highly orchestrated.
Yeah, he and the other men go into the orchard and they loudly gossip, making sure Benedict is hiding in the bushes nearby.
Just listening in.
Right, and they talk about how Beatrice is secretly, desperately dying of love for Benedict, but she is far too proud to ever admit it. And then Hero and her gentlewomen run the exact same play on Beatrice.
They run the exact same script.
They do. They let her overhear that Benedict is agonizingly in love with her.
It is highly manipulative, but it is also highly effective. Hazlitt has a beautiful phrase for this dynamic. He calls this the middle point of comedy, where the ludicrous blends with the tender.
The ludicrous and the tender, I like that.
Yeah. Hazlitt observes that in this middle point, our follies turn around against themselves in support of our affections. The very pride that kept Beatrice and Benedict apart is judo-flipped by their friends to bring them together.
But wait, hold on. I have a really hard time buying the pacing of this. Because someone who has spent years building up cynical armor, who has made hating marriage their entire personality, they don't just drop that armor in 5 seconds because of some gossip they overheard in a bush.
It seems far-fetched, right?
Yeah. Isn't Shakespeare rushing the psychology here for the sake of comedy?
It seems like a rush, but neurobiologically, it's actually incredibly accurate. Think about the cognitive load required to maintain a cynical persona. It is exhausting.
It takes so much energy.
It does. You are constantly scanning for threats, constantly formulating witty comebacks, constantly suppressing your natural human desire for connection. What Don Pedro's trick does is provide a psychological safety net.
Oh, interesting.
By convincing Benedict that Beatrice already loves him, the risk of rejection drops to absolute zero.
Ah, I see. It's a reverse psychological hack. If you walk up to a cynical person and say, hey, you need to be more vulnerable, they will instantly put up a massive wall.
Instantly.
But if you give them a safe narrative like, hey, that person over there thinks you are absolutely amazing, but they are terrified of your intellect, the armor melts. Because fundamentally, we are all desperate to be loved.
Precisely. The core wisdom here is that deception, in this specific benevolent context, doesn't create love out of thin air. It is merely a catalyst. It reveals an underlying truth that was already there.
They were already obsessed with each other.
Exactly. Beatrice and Benedict clearly already had a deep, crackling fascination with one another. The trick simply provided them with the socially acceptable excuse they needed to lay down their exhausting pride.
Beatrice's reaction is the perfect example of that exhaustion ending. She hears that Benedict loves her, and she has been nothing but barbed wire and sarcasm for 2 straight acts.
Nothing but spikes.
Right. But the second she is alone, she steps out of hiding and says, "Contempt, farewell. And maiden pride, adieu." Just like that, it evaporates. It proves how eager the wild heart is to be tamed by kindness, if only it feels safe enough to surrender.
It is a total capitulation to vulnerability, but Benedict's reaction to the trick is equally profound, and it offers us a highly practical framework for our own lives.
Oh, this is the best part.
Because Benedict overhears the men not just saying that Beatrice loves him, but he also overhears them relentlessly roasting his flaws. They call out his pride, his mocking nature, his arrogance.
Right, and noticing you've been manipulated or hearing people talk about your flaws behind your back usually makes people furiously angry.
It's super triggering.
Yeah, it triggers the fight or flight response.
Yeah.
So why doesn't Benedict get defensive? What is happening in his brain in that exact moment that allows him to absorb the criticism instead of fighting it?
It goes back to that dopamine safety net of being loved. Because the criticism is sandwiched inside the revelation of Beatrice's love, his amygdala doesn't hijack his brain.
He feels safe enough to hear it.
Exactly. He is hiding in the arbor, processing the fact that he is perceived as proud and mocking. And instead of launching a counterattack, he absorbs the feedback. He delivers this incredible monologue where he says, "Happy are they that hear their detractions and can put them to mending."
Happy are they that hear their detractions and can put them to mending. That isn't just a funny line in a play. That is a life-changing philosophy.
It's massive.
He realizes that his previous anti-marriage stance, all his sarcastic jokes, were just what he calls paper bullets of the brain.
Paper bullets of the brain. It is one of the most striking metaphors in the text. What does that phrase evoke for you?
Well, it makes me think of military chaff. You know when a fighter jet is being targeted by a heat-seeking missile, and it fires off a cloud of burning metallic paper to confuse the missile's radar?
That is a phenomenal analogy.
That's exactly what Benedict has been doing. His wit, his sarcasm, his intellectual arguments, they are loud, flashy countermeasures designed entirely to distract the incoming missile and prevent a direct hit to his vulnerable heart.
They're completely defensive.
Yeah, they sound threatening, but they have no actual weight against the force of human connection.
And Benedict chooses, in real time, to stop firing the chaff. He lets go of his entire past identity as the untouchable bachelor because he realizes it's serving a false, isolating narrative. He pivots entirely when presented with the truth of his own humanity.
So if you are listening to this right now, we have a direct challenge for you, a practical application of this ancient psychology. I want you to look closely at the paper bullets you are firing off in your own life.
What are they?
Exactly. What are your cynical takes? What are the sarcastic defenses you use? Where are you using your intellect, your humor, or your political arguments to keep people at a safe distance?
And to take that reflection a step further, what feedback or what detraction have you received lately that really stung?
Stuff that hurts to hear.
Right. Maybe a partner pointed out your defensiveness. Maybe a coworker mentioned your tendency to shut down other people's ideas. Your instinct, like Benedict's, is to fire back with paper bullets.
To get defensive.
But what if that detraction is actually an invitation? Can you, like Benedict, say, happy are they that hear their detractions and can put them to mending? Can you drop the ego and use the criticism to grow?
It requires an unbelievable amount of humility to just stand there and say, you know what, I was wrong. I'm going to change my mind. It's beautiful, but, and it's a big but, we have to take a very sharp, very dark turn here.
Yes, we do.
Because while this exact tool of deception, believing what we overhear and oversee, brings Beatrice and Benedict together, it absolutely destroys heroes.
We are moving from the comedy of misperception to the tragedy of misperception. We have to introduce Don John, the illegitimate brother of Don Pedro.
The villain of the piece.
Exactly. If Don Pedro is the architect of benevolent deception, Don John is the architect of malicious deception. He orchestrates a fake encounter solely to ruin Claudio's marriage to Hero. And he does it not for political gain, but out of pure, unadulterated malice and envy.
The way he executes this is so insidious. Act 4 sets the scene perfectly. Don John brings Claudio and Don Pedro to the orchard at midnight. He tells them to look at Hero's bedroom window.
And what do they see?
Up in the window, they see a shadowy woman with a man named Baracchio. Now, the woman is actually Margaret, Hero's attendant, wearing Hero's clothes. But Claudio and Don Pedro see this, and instantly, without a single shred of critical thinking, they believe Hero is disloyal.
And this is where we have to unpack the mechanism of confirmation bias. Why does Claudio believe it so quickly? Why doesn't he just walk up to the window, shine a light, and see who it actually is?
Exactly. Yeah. If I see someone who looks like my fiance kissing someone else in the dark, my first instinct isn't to walk away and plot revenge. Yeah. My first instinct is to walk up and say, hey, what is going on here?
Of course it is.
Why doesn't Claudio do that?
Because the human brain actually prefers a realized fear over ambiguous trust.
Wait, really? Say more about that.
Think about it. Remember, Claudio's underlying fear drilled into him by his patriarchal culture is the fear of being cuckolded, of being made a fool. The ambiguity of trusting another human being is neurologically uncomfortable.
It means you're vulnerable.
Right. When John presents Claudio with evidence that his worst fear is real, Claudio's brain seizes upon it. It resolves the ambiguity. The fear is validated.
The brain goes, aha.
Yes. The brain says, aha, I knew it. I am not a fool. I am a victim. The emotional relief of being right overrides the visual processing center that might have noticed it wasn't actually Hero.
That is terrifying. The emotional relief of being right about your own worst fear.
Yeah.
So he takes this shadowy evidence, and the fallout is catastrophic.
It's just brutal.
He waits until they are at the altar the next morning. In front of the priest, the family, the entire congregation, he publicly shames her. He calls her a rotten orange.
Rotten orange.
Yeah, and he calls her a common stale, which was a profoundly degrading 16th century term for a sex worker. He obliterates her entire existence in a matter of seconds.
Hazlitt has a deeply empathetic reading of this specific scene. While Claudio is raging with these poetic, horrific, rehearsed accusations, Hazlitt points out the affecting simplicity of Hero's defense.
It's heartbreaking.
It really is. Hero is so completely innocent, so confused by the onslaught that she simply asks, "Is my lord well, that he doth speak so wide?"
She thinks he's having a medical emergency. She thinks he must be hallucinating or physically ill to be saying such insane things.
Exactly. Hazlitt notes that the brutality of this scene is shocking, especially for a comedy. It entirely rips the mask off the polite, sophisticated society of Messina. It shows how violent and ruthless conventional society can be when a person's status is threatened.
We have to translate this into a modern context because the parallels are inescapable. What Don John creates is essentially a 16th century deepfake.
That's exactly what it is.
He creates a manipulated image designed to trigger a specific outraged response. And what Claudio executes at the altar is cancel culture at its absolute most visceral and destructive.
It's a public execution of her character.
He sees one piece of manipulated evidence, lacks all critical thinking, and decides to enact a viral public takedown of her reputation in front of her entire community.
The connection to our modern information ecosystem is profound here. We are incredibly quick to believe the worst about people, especially if that new negative information confirms our pre-existing biases or our deepest insecurities.
It just clicks right into place.
Right. The story raises an urgent question about the danger of optical illusions, both literal and digital. It also highlights how terrifyingly fragile a person's reputation is when institutional power turns against them.
Institutional power is the key phrase there.
Yeah.
Because Claudio isn't just a guy, he is a decorated war hero. Don Pedro is the prince. When the men who hold all the social and political power agree on a narrative, Hero's truth doesn't stand a chance.
Her voice is completely erased by their assumed authority.
Which brings us to a part of the text that is genuinely difficult for modern audiences to digest. We have to look at the obstacles to growth in this story. Because after Hero is publicly destroyed by her fiancé, her own support system, her own family, completely collapses.
It is a deeply disturbing moment for a modern listener, and we cannot gloss over it. Leonardo, Hero's own father, the man who has raised her, instantly believes the accusing men over his own weeping daughter.
Sickening.
He looks at her fainting on the floor, and he actually wishes for her death. He says the shame is printed in her blood, and that if she doesn't die of the shock, he wishes he had a dagger to strike at her life himself.
I have to be honest, reading that, I am screaming at my device. I am genuinely furious. He is treating his daughter not like a human being, but like a piece of tainted property that has suddenly lost its market value.
That's exactly how he views it.
His only concern is that his reputation is ruined because her purity is questioned.
Your outrage is completely justified. It is entirely repulsive by our modern ethical standards, and it is at this moment that the friar, the priest performing the wedding, intervenes.
Thank goodness someone does.
Right. The friar observes Hero closely. He looks at her blushes, her shock, her genuine confusion, and he trusts his intuition over the evidence claimed by the princes. He believes she is innocent.
But his solution is, well, it's wild.
His solution to the crisis is bizarre. He proposes that they hide Hero away and publicly announce that she has died of shock and grief.
Right, let's pretend you're dead. This is a massive obstacle for us today. First of all, why should she even want Claudio back after this? He publicly degraded her.
It's a very fair question.
And secondly, why does the woman have to literally play dead to fix a man's mistake? Why does she have to cease to exist just to elicit basic empathy or the benefit of the doubt from her fiancé and her own father? It is intensely uncomfortable and countercultural.
It is uncomfortable, and we must hold space for that. We have to understand that the text reflects severe, very real historical realities about women's vulnerability in the Renaissance. A woman's entire biological and social survival in that era depended on her chastity and her reputation.
She couldn't just move on.
No, she couldn't just get a job and move to a new city. Leonardo's reaction, while horrific, reflects the social reality that a ruined daughter meant a destroyed lineage and total social exile.
So the stakes actually were life and death.
Exactly. The friar suggests the fake death because he understands that in a society where a woman's voice has zero institutional power, literal death is the only thing that'll make the men stop talking and start feeling.
That is a chilling point. She has no voice, so only her absence will be heard. Which brings us to the need for deep discernment. Because if we just throw the text away entirely because the patriarchal framework makes us sick, we actually miss something vital.
We throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Yeah. We have to separate the toxic social dynamics of Messina from the enduring human psychology that the friar outlines when he explains why the fake death will work.
Precisely. We do not blindly endorse the idea that you should marry someone who publicly abused you. We do not endorse Leonardo treating his daughter as tainted property. We read critically.
Right, we take the good and leave the bad.
But let's look at the friar's acute psychological observation of human nature. Hazlitt puts massive emphasis on this specific passage. The friar predicts that once Claudio believes Hero is dead, his anger will turn to mourning.
And why does he think that?
The friar says, "For it so falls out that what we have we prize not to the worthwhiles we enjoy it, but being lacked and lost, why, then we rack the value, then we find the virtue that possession would not show us whiles it was ours."
Then we rack the value. That phrasing is so deliberate, meaning we stretch it, we inflate it, we finally see its true, massive worth.
It is profound.
The friar knows Claudio's brain is currently flooded with ego and defensive rage. He knows Claudio will only remember Hero's actual beauty and virtue once he believes his cruel words have permanently, irreversibly killed her.
It is a profound articulation of the psychology of loss aversion. The human brain is evolutionarily wired to notice changes in our environment, not the baseline.
Oh, that makes sense.
When a relationship, our health, our daily peace, or our social status becomes our baseline, we become completely blind to it. We take it for granted. It's known as hedonic adaptation.
We just get used to the good things.
Exactly. Only when the object of our affection is abruptly removed does our perception become cleansed of ego and entitlement. The friar predicts that the idea of her life shall sweetly creep into his study of imagination.
It is so frustratingly true about human nature. We don't appreciate the floor until it drops out from under us. We don't value our health until we are sitting in a doctor's office waiting for test results.
Or a relationship.
Yeah, we don't appreciate a partner's quiet loyalty until they finally pack their bags and walk out the door. So here is the discernment challenge for you listening right now. How can you rack the value of the people in your life without having to lose them first?
That is the ultimate question of mindfulness. Do you have to wait for a tragedy, a health scare, or a severe breakup to finally see the virtue that possession would not show us?
Hopefully not.
Right. Can you cleanse your own perception today? Can you look at your partner, your career, your friendships, and artificially induce that sense of loss just long enough to realize how devastating it would be if they were gone?
Don't wait for the fake death to appreciate the real life. It's a heavy lesson. Now, as we move toward the final act of our deep dive, we have to talk about how this massive, catastrophic mess actually gets resolved.
And the resolution is my favorite part.
Mine too. Because as these high-status, highly educated nobles are tangling themselves up in these devastating misunderstandings and tragic plots, it is the lowest-status characters in the entire play who actually solve the crime. We have to talk about the wisdom of the fool.
This is undoubtedly one of Shakespeare's most brilliant structural and philosophical choices. Enter Constable Dogberry in the Neighborhood Watch.
Oh, Dogberry.
Dogberry is a bumbling, malapropism-prone local official. He constantly uses the wrong words, trying desperately to sound educated but making an absolute fool of himself in the process. He and his men are the absolute bottom of the social and intellectual hierarchy in Messina.
Dogberry is a legendary character. At one point, he is interrogating the villains, and one of them calls him an ass. Dogberry gets so offended that he spends the rest of the play obsessively demanding that someone write down that he's an ass.
Write me down an ass.
Exactly. Oh, that he were here to write me down an ass. It is hilarious. But structurally, how do these complete buffoons manage to solve the crime that the prince and the war hero couldn't figure out?
They solve it simply by being quiet in the dark. The watchmen are hiding under a penthouse to stay out of the rain. And while they're sitting there, they accidentally overhear Baracchio drunkenly confessing the entire plot to his friend Conrad.
He just spells it all out.
Baracchio explains exactly how Don John paid him to trick Claudio at the window. The watchmen step out, arrest them, and despite Dogberry's absolute agonizing incompetence in interrogating them, the truth eventually makes its way to Leonardo.
Hazlitt has a wonderfully cynical, almost modern political commentary on Dogberry, doesn't he?
He certainly does. Hazlitt calls Dogberry an inimitable specimen of quaint blundering and a standing record of formal gravity of pretension and total want of common understanding.
That is quite the insult.
But Hazlitt goes a step further, and Riley notes that Shakespeare copied this exact type of individual from real life, and that this specific brand of pretentious, formal blundering exists in high-state offices and government bureaucracies even today.
Some things never change, honestly. But it is incredible when you look at the thematic contrast Shakespeare is building here.
It's very intentional.
The high society folks, Claudio, Don Pedro, Leonardo, they are using all their massive intellects, their refined poetry, their high social standing, to completely deceive themselves. They are blinded by their own sophistication.
Overthinking everything.
Yeah, they are outsmarted by a shadow in a window. But the guy who keeps screaming for someone to write him down an ass is the one who ends up holding the actual objective truth.
If we connect this to the broader picture, this touches on a comparative insight found in wisdom traditions globally. It is the archetype of the holy fool.
A holy fool.
Yes. We see it in folklore, in religious traditions, and in philosophy. True insight, true revelation often bypasses the arrogant, the sophisticated, and the powerful. It lands instead with the simple, the humble, and the overlooked.
Because the nobles were blinded by their status? They were blinded by their intense fear of losing that status.
It had too much on the line.
Right. The watchmen weren't trying to protect any grand reputation. They had no status to lose. They were just hiding quietly in the dark, and they just listened. They literally just heard what was being said without projecting 1,000 insecurities, fears, and biases onto it.
Exactly. The intellect, as we saw with Benedict and Beatrice, can be a weapon that keeps truth at bay. The social conventions, as we saw with Claudio and Hero, can be a rigid trap that destroys innocence.
That's all just noise.
But the simple, unpretentious act of listening without presumption, which is what the bumbling watch accidentally achieves, is what eventually restores order to a broken world.
Wow. Okay, we have covered an immense amount of ground today in the murky psychological waters of Messina.
We really have.
We've looked at the masks of cynical wit and rigid convention that we wear to protect ourselves from the vulnerability of love. We've examined the profound danger of deep-faked realities and how our own confirmation bias can lead us to execute viral takedowns of the things we claim to care about.
It's a lot to process.
It is. We've forced ourselves to navigate the deeply uncomfortable patriarchal obstacles to extract the psychology of lost learning, the urgent necessity of racking the value of what we have before it's taken from us. And finally, we uncovered the paradoxical wisdom of fools, where unpretentious simplicity triumphs over arrogant sophistication.
It is a masterful, timeless exploration of the human ego. And I want to leave the listener with a final reflection to mull over, building on everything we've discussed today.
Give it to us.
Take a moment and look closely at the much ado in your own life right now. Are you currently caught up in a drama, a conflict, or a rigid assumption that is built entirely on hearsay, pride, or a deep-seated fear of vulnerability? What would happen if you stopped looking at the shadows on the wall, stepped out from behind your loud paper bullets of the brain, and just looked at the quiet truth standing right in front of you?
That's the heart of this section. This is Wisdom for the Present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.